All right, thank you everyone for jumping on here tonight. I'm just going to wait a couple more minutes here to let a few more people get on, and then we'll get started. All right, good evening, everybody. We're going to get started here. Thanks for coming on tonight. I appreciate this. We'll probably go for about 45 minutes or so. We'll try to keep it kind of to the point, keep it relevant, and hopefully you can at least learn a thing or two tonight. If anything, learn that you're probably not alone in some of the symptoms that you're experiencing. So a little bit about me. I'm Dr. Mitchell Rasmussen. I'm a chiropractor by trade. I'm a certified functional medicine practitioner. And my main clinical interest is in helping individuals live with and improve from their autoimmune conditions. I recently started a multidisciplinary practice in Denver, and we have, Dr. Fahey, one of my partners. He's a neuromusculoskeletal expert. He's neurokinetic therapy practitioner, and he does a lot of the hands-on type of care that we see with our physical medicine patients. And then our third partner, Kate Doherty, she's just finishing up her master's degree in human nutrition, and it's really her and I that head up a lot of this metabolic stuff. I've noticed specifically in this practice versus my previous career, it makes all the difference in the world having a nutritionist. It helps with follow through on the lifestyle stuff and, all of the questions that, to be quite frank with you, I'm not that interested in. I love diagnosing and digging and helping people kind of get on the right path and making big changes. But I would be crazy to think that diet isn't really the hallmark of all of the ways that we help people get better. I've noticed a huge improvement in my ability to give care now that I can utilize a nutritionist on top of my metabolic practice. Yeah, so we're going to go ahead and get started. And first, I want to just talk a little bit about the thyroid itself. Okay, so there you have it. We got that endocrine gland in the front of the lower neck, just below the larynx. The larynx here, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but this larynx is the voice box, okay? This little tiny butterfly-shaped organ secretes hormones which are completely and utterly necessary in order for your metabolism to work, in order for your cells to reproduce, on top of all sorts of gut and liver and detoxification functions. I see these two lobes up here, okay? So we have these two oblong lobes on either side of the trachea. We can call it the windpipe. And that's kind of where a lot of these follicles, which are the hormone secreting cells within the glands, reside. This little area across the middle is called an isthmus. And they actually all have little follicles. And the follicles are the cells that contain globular sacs that have a fluid known as colloid. Now, that'll come into play a little bit later as we start talking about synthesis, but essentially I just want you to think about it as colloid lives in these follicular cells, and it is what secretes not only thyroid hormone in its precursor form, but also the enzymes necessary to convert it and cause it to occur. Okay, so thyroglobulin is what's produced here in these colloidal sacs, and that can be thought of as a prohormone. I don't know how much you understand about that, but essentially a prohormone is a precursor to an active hormone. And usually it's just a protein or a polypeptide, which is many sequences of amino acids, and eventually it will undergo cleavage, one of its ends, and then the hormone can act. I like to picture a prohormone versus an acting active hormone is kind of like a USB drive that has a cap on it. it has all the information necessary. It has all the data there, but it can't be accessed until the cap is taken off. And that's kind of how I look at thyroglobulin, as it eventually will turn into the active thyroid hormone. I want to talk about a little bit of that later as far as feedback loops and how the brain is actually going to be what dictates release here. But for now, I just kind of want you to think that when the body or the tissues or the cells sense that there's more hormone needed, thyroglobulin gets reabsorbed from these little colloidal sacs with all this liquid, and then it gets split into T4 and T3. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the differences of those. About 90% of the thyroid hormone that your thyroid secretes is actually in its less active form, which is called T4. Essentially, it's a thyrine, which is made up of 2 tyrosines, which are amino acids. But essentially, it's 4 molecules of iodine attached to that. Only 10% of the hormone that your thyroid makes is actually active. So our body makes mostly T4, and T4 can become T3 by enzymes that will actually cleave off one of the iodines. When the iodine gets cleaved off, we get T3, and T3 is actually what acts at our tissues. I think it's kind of interesting that, we always think about, and we're going to get into tonight, is, the thyroid disease, especially in the context of an autoimmune condition, it has incredibly little to actually do with the thyroid, and it has more to do with the rest of the body, because most of our peripheral tissues, including, liver, gut, kidney, just to name a few, are actually the tissues that will convert inactive thyroid hormone into active thyroid hormone. There's enzymes called deiodinases, literally meaning to cleave off an iodine. And that's kind of what helps our body make the amount of thyroid hormone we needed. I want to just kind of be complete in this thought. We also convert T4 into something called reverse T3. Reverse T3, we're going to get into it a little bit later as far as when we talk about some of the things that can go wrong with our thyroid hormone physiology. But essentially, you can think of reverse T3 as an inactive form of thyroid hormone. But the problem is that it's still going to compete for binding on the cellular level at the spaces where T3 is meant to be. But when reverse T3 binds there, it's not able to, there's no influence of thyroid hormone onto our tissues. You keep talking about influence on the tissues, like what is thyroid hormone really doing? You think of, we'll get into some of the symptoms, some of the cold and fatigue and brain fog and stuff. And really what's happening is T3, active thyroid hormone, will diffuse all throughout the body, and it'll get into the target cells where it's actually going to go right into the control station, otherwise known as the nucleus. And when the T3 gets into the nucleus, it binds to a couple proteins, and then they actually connect themselves to our DNA within our cell. Now, DNA bound to active thyroid hormone will cause that molecule to increase its rate of whatever it's doing. Most of these messages talking to the DNA actually have to do with metabolism and cell growth. So what we see here is a lot of nutrients are needed for this, and it's really all about the mitochondria. The mitochondria, I'm sure you know from a high school biology class, they're the powerhouses of the cell. Well, T3 influences the mitochondria by increasing not only the creation of energy, but how much energy is dissipated as heat. And that's kind of why when I see someone initially starting on a thyroid condition, where you might be in something called a thyroid storm or something similar, you'll actually be very warm a lot of times because of all this excess heat that's being created because of the extra T3. Why would extra T3 be there if you have hypothyroid? That's kind of the initial response oftentimes to low blood levels and increased TSH, which we'll get into a little bit more in a little bit here. I want to also think as it relates to, you might hear that you gain weight when you have a thyroid condition and, you have less energy to accomplish tasks. Well, really, T3, active thyroid hormone, is stimulating how your body uses carbs and fats. So if you have an issue there, your body's not going to be as efficient at converting that, and that can lead to a lot of problems. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the risks of the conventional approach to thyroid disease. And one of them is just the fact that increased thyroid hormone will actually increase how hard your heart contracts, and it's going to make your heart rate go up. And that can lead to a whole lot of problems. I'm going to move on from here. I think that's enough physiology, but we'll get into a little bit more as we go. So this is kind of our arc of our class tonight. We're going to talk about, some of the main signs and symptoms, some of the typical things that I see walking in my office on a daily basis. Okay, what are some myths that we've been told about our thyroid? Okay, how do things look when they go right, which we just talked a lot about. What about when things go wrong? And then how are we typically treated in the conventional model, where I like to say, your thyroid condition must have the same exact causes as your friend's thyroid condition because you're being treated the same. And I obviously say that somewhat tongue in cheek. Okay, we're going to get into the immune system because that's the whole crux of the thing. And then we're going to talk about a few concepts that I'm sure you might have heard of. Some of these unique autoimmune concepts that are becoming more and more popular nowadays as more empirical evidence comes out. And then we're going to get into actual, if you're monitoring your thyroid, because yes, we want to figure out why your thyroid is acting the way it is, but we still need to monitor certain biomarkers within the thyroid itself. And we'll talk about kind of how I do that versus how a conventional approach might be. And then we're just going to get into some real basic functional medicine treatment stuff. Okay, so who are you? This is mostly what I see kind of coming in the door here. Okay, a lot of GI stuff. We're going to add a couple of things here, and really a lot of these are related to one another. When I think of, acid reflux and, GERD and heartburn and things like that, oftentimes low stomach acid is related to this gastric reflux. That might seem kind of crazy because we tell ourselves, I have a increased stomach acid because I can feel it when it comes up and when I get that heartburn feeling. So what do I want to do? I want to take an acid blocker. The problem with that is oftentimes when we feel those gastric reflux type of symptoms, we have low stomach acid, but what happens is stress or H. pylori or any number of other types of conditions actually cause that lower sphincter that sits between your esophagus and your stomach. It causes it to stay open, which allows whatever stomach acid you're making to kind of climb up and cause some of those symptoms. So a very good short-term approach, obviously, is to block the acid, but we need that hydrochloric acid not only to fight off infections and foodborne illness, but to digest and kind of chop up our food. We need that hydrochloric acid. It's key for health. I've seen correlations between low stomach acid and intestinal permeability. That's the fancy leaky gut. And the inflammation and infection. I kind of call that the three I's of hypochlorhydria. You have your intestinal permeability, you have your inflammation, and you have your infections. Infections being pathogens in the gut and the like. Also, I just wanted to mention studies have actually shown a correlation and a strong association between something known as atrophic gastritis, which is a condition in the gut linked to low stomach acid, and autoimmune thyroid disease, which I think is quite interesting. We're talking, thinking about constipation, diarrhea. Whenever you have diarrhea, food stuff is moving through you too quickly, and that's problematic for a whole host of reasons. And one of them is the fact that our gut bacteria are responsible for converting about a fifth of our inactive thyroid hormone into active thyroid hormone. Our gut bugs, a healthy gut bacteria, so if we have dysbiosis, this isn't going to happen. But our healthy gut bacteria produce an enzyme known as intestinal sulfatase. And intestinal sulfatase is responsible for about 20% of inactive thyroid hormone being converted into active. That's a huge number, 20%, just from having healthy gut bacteria. So this is where I see the connection all the time in the clinic between a dysbiotic gut environment and autoimmunity. And we're going to get into a little bit more of that as we go. Constipation is a little bit different, but I see this a lot. And, and a myth we're about to talk about is, you have constipation, so just eat more fiber. And, sometimes that'll help, definitely. And I do that for patients often. But I want to think about as it relates to my thyroid condition is when I'm constipated, I will have impaired clearance of hormones. Okay. And that's going to lead to elevation, specifically in women, of estrogens. And I find probably 10 to 1 in my practice, women to men coming in with an autoimmune thyroid condition. I think there's a lot of reasons which we can maybe get into in a future episode, but suffice it to say, when I'm constipated, my estrogen, it stays elevated, and that in turn is going to raise something known as thyroid binding globulin. And when we have increased thyroid binding globulin, that's going to actually decrease how much free hormone is in the blood, which then causes all sorts of issues, including constipation. Okay, and then I'm even thinking about gastric motility, which we talk a lot about the vagus nerve and the parasympathetic nervous system and this and that, which can help stimulate something called peristalsis in the gut. Well, it's been shown that when you have low functioning thyroid, you actually have a slower contraction of the smooth muscle in the gut, and that's going to increase how long it takes for food to move through. It's just kind of a time and push thing, so we're not pushing that far, that hard. If that motility is down because we have low thyroid function, thyroid is what increases the ability of our gut to contract the smooth muscle. You can see how this is going to also lead to constipation, increased inflammation, and the like. Okay, as I kind of look at these nutrient deficiencies, I see the nutrient deficiencies as a result of the acid reflux not allowing you to digest, and the constipation not allowing you to properly absorb. So when you come in the clinic, we're not going to just, we don't analyze, how well are you digesting something or this or that. We're looking at not only digestion, but also absorption, because absorption is how you get nutrients into your cells, plain and simple. And all of these, I'm going to add a couple more here: muscle aches and pains, poor sleep, you're always cold, irregular menstrual cycles. Looking all around, there's so many symptoms here that are actually related to impaired liver detox. And hypothyroidism is related with that, in that it's going to impair our ability for our gallbladder to secrete bile. Okay, we use bile to digest fat-soluble nutrients and vitamins. And then now we have the nutrient deficiency causing more bile stagnation, causing more nutrient deficiency, and we get stuck in this cycle. I also see, the gallbladder and the liver are intimately related. And typically when a gallbladder is not working, it's also going to interfere with our liver's ability to detoxify. We go right back to increased estrogen because the liver is completely overwhelmed and it can't do its job. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about allergies and the food intolerances when we actually look at the gut. Okay, and then that's just, I wanted to put that because you're obviously not alone. I've recently read that upwards of possibly 60% of people walking around with a thyroid condition don't even know they have it. They've maybe gone to the doctor and been told that they're normal and it's in their head and that it's IBS and this and that. And that's a pretty disempowering place to put somebody. And unfortunately, that's typically when I find you, is when you've been to all these doctors, you've been told you're fine, and you're not really being listened to. So part of what we believe in our functional medicine model is what's called the biopsychosocial model of healthcare, where you are a biological being, but you're also a psychological being. And if your mind is somewhere else, and if your mind is stuck in the worry and the concern and the anxiety, it just becomes this whole self-feeding cycle of negativity. And we always say, with these types of cycles, where do we start with somebody? Well, what I figured out over the years is we should start somewhere. Okay, plain and simple. Let's just start somewhere, and let's start to insert some wins into your daily life. Let's start to decrease your toxic burden from functional medicine testing to figure out kind of where your big impediments are. And then from there, we can start to heal. But if we just go around saying it's all in your head, you're fine, this and that, oh, you had a kid, that's why, or, whatever you've been told, unfortunately, we're always going to stay sick and tired. And that's just an unfortunate place to be. Okay, so here's some myths. I hear this all the time. Well, my mom has hypothyroidism and my grandma has it and I have it. Okay, so obviously genetics predispose us to all sorts of things, but there's not one piece of DNA that's been elucidated that says, aha, you have the Hashimoto's gene. Okay, genetics always play a role, which we're going to talk about, but it's definitely not the whole picture. Okay, we're going to get big time into this tonight, the diet having to do with your condition. We don't say you are what you eat, we say you are what you eat eats, and it all matters. And our, this GI tract is 20 some feet long, a single cell layer thick, this intimate relationship between our immune system, our gut, and our bloodstream, and it's prone to having breakdown in some of these proteins when our diet is not on point. That's a huge part of autoimmune thyroid disease, is getting that gut back online, and we'll kind of talk about what that looks like. I can't tell you how many times I've heard this. You're essentially, the conventional model is waiting for you to be so sick that they can then put you on a synthetic hormone for the rest of your life. It bothers me because this was back in 2003. which I've been preaching for years, the American Academy of Clinical Endocrinology actually sent out a statement where they were proclaiming that the range for TSH should be drastically reduced from this 0.5 to 4.5 TSH level. What they found was on initial studies looking at TSH, most of the people, or a lot of the people that were included in these air quote normal thyroid findings had underlying thyroid disorders. So they were getting a kind of a skewed palette of people that they were testing, which tended to shift that acceptable number for TSH into the higher direction. And I also just see it as, why should we wait until you're so sick that you need synthetic hormones when we know that there's 100% things that we can do today to get better? Okay, just take more iodine. After all, thyroid hormone, all it is iodine and then 2 molecules of an amino acid called tyrosine. We need both of these in the diet. And I find this interesting. Thyroid hormone is actually the only biologically active substance that has iodine. So sometimes I'll have people that come in, and certain clinicians are like this too, and they will assume more iodine is needed. Personally, I tend to be a little bit cautious with that, partly because the current best practices as far as how to test body iodine levels is a 24-hour urine collection. And everything I've seen, there's not much as far as independent validations on a gold standard. So I don't really totally feel comfortable giving iodine recommendations based on that test. And on top of the fact that to test it, you're going to be carrying a jug of urine around with you for an entire day. I also see, some risks associated with overuse of iodine. And it's definitely known to play a role. Absolutely. And sometimes, say we get stuck and we've been, hitting your Epstein-Barr, we've been working on your dysbiosis, we've been working on your heavy metal, we've been working on your stress and all these things, and we still feel that there's a little bit more that we can go. We'll consider adding food sources like seafoods and things to your diet, and we'll just see how you do. Versus, trying to go right in there with an iodide supplement. Oftentimes patients come to me on a pretty robust dose of levothyroxine, and their doctor is testing them once, twice, 3 times a year, maybe. That scares me because TSH, which is the hormone that's tested by these conventional approaches, it can change within 30 seconds. Okay, it's very transient in the blood. So you might have had one thing that caused TSH to go up, and then you went and got your blood drawn that day and you had a really high level. So then they start to dose you at a high level of thyroid hormone for the next 6 months. And it's bad medicine, in my opinion. We know so much more now, and you deserve to get better answers than, oh, take this pill for 3 months and we'll check you again. Okay. And here we go back into the constipated, just take more fiber. I hear that all the time. And then this right here, how could you get more disempowered by someone? I hear this all the time. This is only going to get worse. The only option is to keep taking medications, and then eventually your thyroid goes out completely, or it turns into a carcinoma or a follicular cancer, and then we need to irradiate it, and then you're on a high dose of thyroid hormone for the rest of your life. And then this, I just think that's funny. You just have a bad thyroid. Your thyroid didn't do this to you, okay? Your thyroid is in so many ways the victim, not really the perpetrator. And I love to say that, but it has so much more to do with the state of the rest of your body than it has to do with just this tiny little lobe-shaped gland in the front of your neck. All right, so let's just talk a little bit about, when things are grooving the way they need to be grooving, we've got this cool system set up with all sorts of these red lines, which are these feedback loops. So right at the top, we have our hypothalamus, which is in our brain, okay? It's gonna release something called thyrotropin releasing hormone. And that's what travels, well, not very far. It actually goes right to the anterior pituitary gland. Those 2 structures, the hypothalamus and the pituitary, they're actually connected physically via something called the pituitary stalk. And that pituitary stalk has a bunch of blood vessels and nerve fibers, and that's constantly communicating between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. That's a very common thing as you start to get into endocrinology, and you'll see that hypothalamus to pituitary signaling disrupted in all sorts of stress-mediated conditions, including autoimmune thyroid disease, which is why we're here tonight. So hypothalamus releases TRH. TRH goes through the stalk into the anterior pituitary, And that's where TRH is going to trigger the pituitary to release something known as thyroid stimulating hormone. What I find ironic is you go to the doctor, you get your air quote thyroid tested, and they're measuring something that's not even from your thyroid, it's from your brain. Okay, which doesn't have so much to do with your thyroid. The reason is a negative feedback loop, and it's shown that high TSH means the pituitary is kicking out more hormone to the thyroid to try to get the thyroid to kick out more hormone. But I digress. The point is, the pituitary is what makes the TSH, not the thyroid. Okay, so the thyroid is going to travel from the pituitary to the gland itself, and that's going to trigger the creation and then subsequent release of inactive T4. Okay, T4 is mostly inactive. Once T4 gets into the bloodstream, it's going to get split as needed into active thyroid hormone. And you can see from these red arrows here, T4 release also exerts this negative feedback loop to the pituitary and hypothalamus. What does that mean? When things are working well, it self-regulates. Okay, it's able to tell itself or to know when there's enough happening, so the body will, the T4 will signal up to the brain, hey, stop telling me to make more thyroid hormone. It's a really cool process. And that's a negative feedback loop. When things are going well, you're only going to make as much as you need. It kind of makes sense, right? One of the problems here is when we start to get stressed out, which we'll talk about a little bit later, T4 will get converted into not only active T3, which will have the negative feedback loop, but it will also get shuttled into something called reverse T3. Reverse T3 is going to compete with active T3 at the target cells. The problem is, where T3 is going to change genetic signaling and protein synthesis, reverse T3 is just going to kind of sit there and clog the way and not allow any of that action in those cells. Okay, so when we think about what goes wrong, which is typically where you find me, this is a cool graphic from the Institute for Functional Medicine. And you can just see here, it's pretty self-explanatory as far as what can make it worse, what can make it better. But I just want to kind of point out a few things here, things that I see in the clinic. Oftentimes I'll see heavy metal poisoning leading to decreased synthesis of active T3. And what's going on there is a lot of metals, like heavy metals, they actually look somewhat similar to iodine, and they're going to end up binding to sites that iodine should be binding in the thyroid. Obviously, the problem there is mercury is not part of active thyroid hormone. Remember, we said it's tyrosine plus iodine. If mercury is in the way, now iodine can't bind, meaning I'm going to be making less active thyroid hormone. Not only that, but mercury is incredibly toxic to the thyroid gland itself. Okay, I typically see once you have one autoimmune disease, you're going to have another. Again, it speaks more to your immune system than your actual gland that's been assaulted. We'll get into a little bit more of that. Okay, and we also see toxins, infections. We're going to get into all sorts of these things, as well as certain medications that are kind of clogging up this whole system. That you can see on the right side, this is where a good micronutrient or an organic acids test comes in useful, because we can measure levels of most of these nutrients in the blood. You see this first one right here, iron. Okay, when you're low iron, you think about iron deficiency anemia. Our body, when we are iron deficient, goes into a state called hypoxia, which is low blood oxygen. Low blood oxygen is a signal to the immune system that it needs to create something called NF-kappa B. NF-kappa B leads to downstream inflammatory process, including autoimmune thyroid destruction. We're going to show a little graph that kind of lays that out a little bit later. And then I just wanted to point out this vitamin A and zinc. I have not found yet an individual who came in the clinic whose zinc level that I tested who had an appropriate zinc level. Okay, almost always we are going to see low serum zinc, low plasma zinc within the context of an autoimmune condition. Here's an interesting thing. A couple weeks ago, I actually had a patient. She came in. She wasn't even aware of her autoimmune thyroid disease, but she didn't feel well. We ended up finding a really high cadmium level in her blood, as well as a couple other heavy metals. And the conventional thought is when you have a heavy metal, you can actually give something called selenium, which is a mineral that's in Brazil nuts. You can give selenium, which will start to crowd out some of the heavy metals in the thyroid. But research shows this. If you already have a selenium sufficiency, meaning your blood level of selenium is high enough, there's no benefit to increasing selenium status. In fact, higher selenium over time, even though in proper levels it functions kind of as an antioxidant, higher blood levels of selenium over time lead to pro-oxidation. Oxidation is kind of one of the roots of a lot of chronic disease. You know, we've heard of oxidative stress, right? Free radicals, reactive oxygen species, all of these things that can be triggered by having excess antioxidants. And kind of the point I'm trying to make is we don't like to guess on things, okay? We like to know for sure what's going on in your physiology. And that's a prime example with that woman where if I had seen the, you know, the high cadmium and just shot from the hip and said, okay, we're going to dose your selenium, we're going to take care of this and we're going to start to chelate some of those heavy metals. Well, she already had a high blood level and I could have made her problem worse. So this is just what I'm getting into of why we do our due diligence and we're always testing to make sure we really know what's going on there. Vitamin A deficiency, that's really common when you have leaky gut. And I see that a lot with celiac patients. Okay, I find essential fatty acid like omega-3s, I find those to be low a lot of times in this population, as well as vitamin A, which is a fat-soluble vitamin. We're starting to put the picture together a little bit. Our gallbladder isn't working, our bile is being stagnated. We need our bile in order to absorb and digest and emulsify our fats, including our fat-soluble vitamins, which are A, D, E, and K. And when we don't have that system working, it feeds into all sorts of these deficiencies that then feed themselves. All right, let's just look at when you walk into your conventional endocrinologist and your thyroid disease is the same as everyone else's. They're going to weigh you and they're going to give you a dose of levo. Okay, and obviously there's other forward-thinking clinicians that will also give like a compounded form of thyroid hormone. But when you're looking at levothyroxine, which is the most commonly prescribed med, that's actually only T4. What do we know about T4? It's inactive. So we're assuming that our gut is working, where a fifth of that conversion from T4 to T3 happens, but oftentimes the gut isn't working and that conversion can't happen. So now you're taking T4 and your symptoms get worse. I'm sure some of you right now are nodding and maybe a little bit frustrated knowing this was me. I was given levo, my symptoms got worse, I started to get heart palpitations, and all they did was decrease my dose for a little bit and try it again. My TSH looks normal, but I feel like crap. Okay, that's so many times I hear that. And keep in mind, I mean, normally, you know, I might have said this, but, you know, I'm going to be the third or fourth person you're probably coming to see for this, unfortunately. So I tend to get people kind of at their last straw, which is you know, it's kind of a sad place to be, but, you know, I think, again, empowerment and information goes a long ways. Okay, again, we don't make as much stomach acid when we have autoimmune thyroid disease, which means we're not going to even absorb what we're taking. Like we said before, thyroid hormone, especially T4, leads to increased heart rate. So we are worried with people who have CVD, which is just cardiovascular disease. We're worried with those types of people taking too much levo. So typically they'll be dosed a little bit lower, and we'll do a lot more monitoring of that heart and, you know, getting more work with your cardiologist. I think that's kind of funny. I just, you know, that's what I hear all the time. Your thyroid condition is the same as everybody else's, so let's treat you the same. Let's not. All right. This fancy little graph is from one of my functional immunology postgraduate trainings, and I love this. And it's a little bit confusing when you look at it all at once, but if we break it down, we start to kind of see how the whole system is related, okay? So as we look here, autoimmunity and inflammation, when you see this word coactivation, I'm assuming you know that that means that they stimulate one another. So when I have inflammation, I'm going to have autoimmune tissue destruction. What do I mean by that? The language of the immune system is inflammation. When the immune system responds to a virus or to a bug or to anything, its main its main language is just to produce inflammation through neutrophils and macrophages that come in and kind of debride whatever's happening, and then they help your body clear infections. The problem with autoimmunity is the inflammation a lot of times is never, the source of it is never found, so it just takes off uncontrollably. Okay, as we look kind of into the stress chemistry, when you're inflamed, you're going to make more catecholamines. Catecholamines are like dopamine and adrenaline and things like that. And when you make that stuff over time, those are your stress hormones. That causes more inflammation. So now your inflammation is causing you to have higher levels of stress hormones, which then cause you to have more inflammation. And then we get stuck in what I talk to patients about all the time is these loops. Okay, you're stuck in these loops right there. And we need to find a way into the system. Dysbiosis is just an imbalance of gut bugs. Okay, so now we're thinking about that, 20% of thyroid hormone gets converted in the gut. You're dysbiotic. That's not happening, besides the fact that you're going to be inflamed because your immune system is trying to kind of balance out all these dysbiotic bugs. What I find the most troubling here is typically autoimmune patients have multiple co-infections, something like Epstein-Barr or even Candida tropicalis, or there's all sorts of different types of infections. And when you get the infections, because of the inflammation causing your immune system to be less active, that leads to more infection, which then feeds the inflammation. And here we are again, we're right back to our cycle of inflammation. Additionally, oftentimes with this, this imbalanced immune response, when our innate immunity goes down, that's something called Th1 or T helper cells 1 status, which is part of our innate immune system. When that goes down, the balance shifts towards Th2 dominance. And when we have a dominance in our Th2 status, which this is never static, this is constantly moving. When we have an imbalanced Th2 status, that tends to cause hollow space infections, hollow space inflammations, things of the bladder, the vagina, the urinary tract, the sinuses, things like that. So we get upper respiratory, UTIs, allergies, asthma, all of the like. Okay, so essentially this is kind of the process that people get stuck in when they come to our clinic. The other thing I want to notice is one of the final kind of straws that has people eventually do something about this is my brain wasn't working, right? My brain wasn't working because this inflammation ends up causing neurovascular inflammation as well as brain inflammation. Okay, so it's kind of all related here. These top left, these little orange boxes, that might as well say things we look at in functional medicine. Okay, that's a very broadly arranged group of things that essentially we try to X off as we go into our initial investigation when you come in the door. Okay, so like we said, your genetics are definitely part of the puzzle here, but we really want to look at what this expert, he's a world-renowned GI doc, Dr. Alessio Fasano. He's been in the research for quite a while now. And he talks a lot about there needing to be 3 distinct factors present in order for any type of autoimmune tissue destruction to begin. And as you see this, you're going to start to maybe piece together why once you get one autoimmune disease, it's much more likely for you to get another one. Okay, so we have our genetic predisposition always. You have genes that are going to signal for things to harm you and genes that are going to signal for things to hurt you, but our lifestyle is what primarily dictates which genes are on and which genes are off. And obviously I'm simplifying this quite a bit. The next kind of trigger, this part of the 3-legged stool, is an instigator, okay? This again is all of the stuff that we look for in a functional medicine practice. It's the heavy metals, it's the stress response, it's the dysbiosis, it's the infections, it's the mold, it's all of these things. It's the stress that's not checked. It's the poor diet. It's all of this stuff that can eventually cause a breach in our gut. Once we get a breach in our gut, now our immune system is responding to whatever that instigator was. And what I was saying earlier, with our gut is it's a very intimate relationship between our inside of our GI tract and our bloodstream. And there's 70, maybe 75% of our immune system resides in our gut. Everyone says that, but nobody really thinks about what that means. I mean, that's insane, right? We have something called GALT. It's gut associated lymphoid tissue. And that's a huge part of our immune system, which is constantly sampling things from inside of that environment and telling our brain all sorts of things. And that's how even an imbalanced gut microbiome can lead to anxiety. And we say trust your gut and things like that. I mean, the gut is very much a second brain. And just kind of a little side note, I found it fascinating years ago when I learned that there's not that many cells going between the brain and the gut, and most of them are going up from the gut to the brain. And what I'm saying is there's a lot of independent action of the gut that's not being told by the brain what to do. It's more that the gut sends information back to the brain about its environment and much less coming down the other way. Okay? And then you might ask, well, what's going to contribute to your GI barrier becoming breached? And this is where we get into the thing that everyone wants to talk about is our leaky gut, right? This GI tract, that's where your food gets broken down so that you can absorb everything. And this is where the immune system is. Again, I want you to think about the GI tract as being on the outside of your body. It is the barrier between the outside world and our internal organs. And what I mean by saying it's on the outside of your body is you're inside of the inside of a tube. It's all inclusive from your mouth to your anus. So there's literally this whole relationship between that outside world within the inside and our internal organs. And that's what we're talking about with this barrier. Okay. We have these little proteins. I'm going to show you a picture after this. They're called tight junctions. And when we start to get permeability, those tight junctions will break down. And that's actually where the term leaky gut comes from, is when this breakdown happens, it allows the certain substances that come into the bloodstream, and that actually is what triggers our leaky gut. And then what do we talk about? The immune system's language is inflammation. When the immune system sees these things that aren't meant to be in the bloodstream, it mounts an inflammatory response to try to combat it. And this is typically what I see with individuals who have leaky gut, and you'll notice most of them are also symptoms of autoimmune thyroid disease. Okay, so this is kind of what we're talking about, and I want you to think about it like this. You cannot be healthy without a healthy gut, okay? This is where the nutrients happen, and this is where diseases get stopped from coming into the bloodstream. And without good integrity here, it's going to be very common for you to get this autoimmune disease. And then we're going to talk about after this and kind of finish up with it, something called molecular mimicry, which is a fun new topic that we're getting into now in the alternative and functional medicine world. So I always say your leaky gut didn't cause your leaky gut, meaning we can fix your leaky gut. We can repair these tight junctions and make a better intestinal mucosa. But if we don't figure out why it happened in the first place, you're just going to be doing a leaky gut protocol ad infinitum until you're dead. So I would rather, figure out your causes while we allow the gut to heal. Keep in mind, your gut turns over. The cells in your gut are turning over constantly. So you're getting new cells here. It's not like we need to do this for months and years typically, even with a pretty damaged gut. If we get onto the right things and we eliminate the proper triggers that are unique to you, then we can work to restore that gut pretty quickly, okay? I see all of these up top as potential reasons why we would trigger that intestinal damage, but the one I want to focus on, because this is what we definitely all have control over, is a little bit of stress and then dietary proteins, meaning what we're eating. Okay, so stress increases levels of cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone. High cortisol over time tends to break down the mucus that lines our gut. And when we break down the mucus, it makes these little villi, these little cells, become more exposed to these dangerous contents within the gut, okay, like hydrochloric acid and foodborne illnesses and things like that. So number one, chronic stress starts to break down that mucus that protects our gut. But then specifically thinking about dietary proteins like glutamine or something like that, that is not only going to start to break down this lining, but once it breaks down the lining and enters the bloodstream, like we said, it's a single layer of cells. It's very intimate. Once we get this breakdown, tight junctions start falling apart, cells open up, so to speak, things leak out into the bloodstream. And can you kind of guess that that's not supposed to be in the bloodstream? Whatever was in the gut, undigested or unabsorbed, is not meant to shift right into the bloodstream. It's meant to go through these intestinal mucosal cells. It's not meant to just jump right in. When it jumps right into the bloodstream, now our body makes antibodies, which we're going to talk a little bit about, and our antibodies kind of go in and try to kill that. This is where the term molecular mimicry kind of comes in. Our GI tract becomes permeable, leading to the leaky gut. These little spot welds that are the tight junctions start to break down, and then that's going to lead to certain release of chemicals into the bloodstream. Okay, one of the chemicals that we hear a lot of is something called lipopolysaccharide, LPS. Okay, that is a gram-negative endotoxin from a gram-negative bacteria, and that is rapidly attacked by our immune cells because it really doesn't want that to be in there. Okay, so as we get into molecular mimicry here, we're about to finish up. I want you to think about, we're going to talk about these antibodies a little bit, but essentially in molecular mimicry, your immune system is going to react to whatever it's being insulted by, whatever gets into the bloodstream at any given moment. Okay, an incredibly common immune response is for the body to make proteins that are known as antibodies. And these antibodies can, in a way, remember specific structural proteins of whatever the insult was. So you look here at this antigen, that's like a H. pylori or a E. coli or something like that. And then we have these antibodies here that have these little arms that will recognize a part called the epitope, or this little piece of the antigen. And that's what it's going to recognize and bind to, and then try to remove it through a really complicated process or multiple different processes. The problem is these antibodies are responding to proteins, but sometimes when this offending pathogen or this antigen is actually coming from our gut because of the leaky gut, it's feeding itself. Your immune system is constantly going to be responding to these gluten subfractions or whatever comes through the leaky gut. And because you haven't fixed the barrier, it's like you're trying to pull water out of a boat without fixing the leaks. Okay, so we need to make sure not only do we get the water out of the boat, but we need to fix the leaks. The word molecular mimicry kind of comes in here. The system is not foolproof, okay? There's so many proteins in biology that resemble one another. And as long as the structure of this trigger is kind of close to the structure of another protein, sometimes your antibodies, your immune system will actually start to respond to other things. Unfortunately, some of our body proteins look like certain dietary proteins. Now, your thyroid, which very much resembles proteins within casein, which is in dairy, as well as gluten, which is in wheat, which is all the yummy grain stuff, right? Those proteins tend to kind of resemble this thyroid molecule, these thyroid proteins. So then the body starts to attack, the antibodies start to attack the thyroid, and that's where you get your autoimmune tissue destruction. So literally your immune system is trying to do what it can. It's doing the best it can. It's running around attacking whatever it finds that looks similar to the offending trigger, and it's not foolproof. And molecular mimicry is becoming a very, very popular type of concept in functional medicine. You know, and just kind of as a little bit, these antibodies, you might have heard of them called immunoglobulins, right? That's what it gets tested in your blood. And that's a protective protein made by the immune system when it senses that something is going wrong. Okay, so essentially you're going to have some alien substance is going to enter the body. The immune system recognizes it and can tell that it's foreign because our body proteins have certain molecular patterns on them that foreign proteins don't. So when they don't see these proteins, they can recognize that it's not from the body, and it starts to eliminate them through a bunch of different mechanisms. But it gets complicated because they're not able to always just pick out only whatever's been, you know, kind of triggering the symptom. Okay, so this is obviously a very old 20-year-old diagram here, but I liked the cartoon kind of character of it, and you can see how these little antibody arms are going to grab onto disease-causing substances when everything's working well and kind of pull them out of the bloodstream. The problem is it's not working well when we have our unchecked leaky gut. Okay, so let's just think about quickly here. We do obviously want to look at the thyroid itself and look at, you know, various different hormones and biomarkers. But essentially, I just wanted to show you here, if you look at the conventional range, that's a, you know, typical standard range here, and that's basing on, you know, how much drug to give you. but we've developed much tighter ranges, and this is partly empirical and partly in the the newest research. And what we notice is if we can keep patients, with some of their thyroid numbers in these levels, they tend to be a heck of a lot happier and they tend to feel a whole lot better. Okay. And then I just want to, this is kind of, what we talk about is in functional medicine is your genes are like loading a gun, and then your environment decides whether or not to pull the trigger. Okay. We like to start simple. Some functional medicine practitioners will overwhelm you with 27 different supplements and these creams and powders and potions and all sorts of this stuff, when really what we want to get you back down to is just kind of like come home to yourself, come home to being mindful and being a participant in your healing journey. And once we start to make a few changes, number one, we're going to feel better in almost all the cases. And number two, we're going to start to want to make more changes because of our improvement. And then that's where we can start to slowly dig into more of your physiology, maybe run a heavy metal screen. We might look for mold or things like that. And again, that's all dictated based on your history and what you come in with. Whenever someone walks in the door with an autoimmune thyroid condition, I don't have my go-to tests that I'm going to look at necessarily. I have things I often will look at, but it really is just dictated off what you're coming in the door with. Okay. And I always try to remind you, like, say you have Epstein-Barr virus, which is very common in autoimmune thyroid disease. We're not going to remove that trigger, right? A virus is largely going to live with you, or, not really live, but be with you forever. But it doesn't always have to be stimulating an immune response. And if we can eliminate other triggers like heavy metals, mold, nutrient deficiencies, or the like, then the Epstein-Barr virus tends to kind of lay latent, not triggering immune system response. Again, the immune system response is inflammation. So if we can limit the other triggers, it kind of seems like now this Epstein-Barr isn't as much of an issue. Okay. I think about it as, repair the broken system, set the tone for the body to heal itself. I get emails from parents of patients, and, they'll tell me, like, I just can't believe it's that simple that we just needed to remove these 3 things and so-and-so's headaches are gone, or, their energy is coming back. But really, we were meant to feel well, right? We were meant to express ourselves fully through health, and life in a lot of ways has gotten us down. And that does not mean that that's where we're stuck to be, but we definitely need to get in and repair some of these broken systems so our body can start to turn over new tissue and heal. When I was making this, we decided as a team that our next webinar is going to be on stress and sleep, just because, I could get into a whole 45 minutes about the stress response system in thyroid disease, which eventually I'll kind of connect next time. But really, I'm just looking at, if I can mitigate my stress, I know that stress directly contributes to or causes every chronic condition that we have in modern society. Okay, so we absolutely can repair your diet. We can give you supplements to help your detoxification. We can chelate your heavy metals. We can do all these things. But if we don't reduce your stress, you might as well keep your money in your pocket. Okay, and I'm big on this point. We actually have a mindfulness coach who I can specifically prescribe sessions with him to work on getting people to be more aware in their daily lives to reduce their stress, because we know how important that piece is. And oftentimes that's the piece that people aren't willing to work on, right? It's just like we're stuck in this life and we got all these things happening, and I call it death by 1,000 paper cuts. Nothing is overtly, likely to kill you, but all these little things really kind of wear you down, and they will set the tone for inflammation and autoimmune tissue destruction. And then just kind of leave you with a couple things here. Hashimoto's more about your immune system than your gland, which we've said 58 times, so I'm hoping you heard it by now. And then this is kind of what I tell my patients. Let's remove the impediments to your biology while supporting what isn't working so well, okay? So it's like we're taking our foot off the brake, we're halting the damage, and then we're helping the damage heal. Okay. And it's never the wrong thing to do the right thing. And sometimes just dietary changes aren't enough, but that doesn't mean that a healthy diet was the wrong move. It just meant we have more work to do, if that makes sense. All right. Well, that's kind of what we were trying to get at. I went a little long, so thanks for staying. If you're interested, that's our website, that's our Instagram, that's our physical location. And then for coming tonight, you'll be getting an email We'll give you like $50 off a first visit with me to come sit and chat about this if this is something that you're interested in. And just, let me leave you tonight. Just, you are not alone in this. Like, there are people like me because there are people like you, and you are not the only one. And just, feel confident in knowing that there's always hope, regardless of what's going on. John Kabat-Zinn talks a lot about, if there's a beating heart in your chest and air in your lungs, there's more going right for you now than is going wrong. And I think we can embody that and just remind ourselves that we're still here, we're still fighting, so we might as well try to feel well. And that's kind of the whole idea of functional medicine, in my perspective, is, I'm not trying to live forever or help someone else live forever. I'm trying to enjoy and be pleasant and feel well with the time that I have here on this earth. Okay, so again, it's not about living forever or ignoring your own mortality. It's about feeling well while you're here. And that's what I want to help you guys with. Okay. So yeah, again, thanks for listening. Reach out to me. I'd love to get some feedback and hear what you're thinking about future things you might want to talk about. Yeah, and I'd love to hear some feedback. I hope you have a great night, and I will talk to you later.